Okay, so first off, thank you all for agreeing to participate in this conversation. I started it mostly because of the Black Lives Matter movement, but also because I've kind of always wanted to do this, and I think it would be a good conversation to have in general, especially for educators right now. I think we need to discuss diversity in the classroom on a broad scale. I have also had the honor and pleasure of being taught by all but one of you, which makes it even better that you guys agreed to do this. So first, what I want to start off with is just like small introduction about yourselves. I know you submitted bios to me already, but I think it would help in the conversation as well. So if you could just tell me a little bit about yourselves, your teaching experience, the current grade level you teach, and if you're a professor, any primary research interests, or not even if you're a professor, just in general, primary research interest. I'll go first. I'm Kiara Wynn, and I'm not a teacher, but I am the founder of Artistas de Color Unidos, which is an online arts gallery that looks to serve, empower, and uplift artists of color. I'm currently an undergraduate student at the University of Southern California, pursuing a double major in psychology and NGOs and social change. And although I am not yet a teacher, I would like to go into the education field one day. Dr. Leal, if you can start us off, I guess, please.
Sure. I thought we were going to go alphabetical, but this works. Jorge Leal, a historian by training. I am currently starting my position as an assistant professor at UC Riverside in the Department of History. So I teach college, but I had experience also teaching basically the general public at LACMA, at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And in terms of my research interest, it is Latinx history, but also U.S. history, and also how people of color are part of U.S. history. So that's kind of broad, but then, like in the more specific, I look at youth cultures as kind of like my research.
I don't know how you guys looks, but Mr. Thalker, if you can just go next, I guess.
Sure. My name's Dan Thalker. I'm currently a U.S. History and Ethnic Studies teacher at an LAUSD school in South Central LA. Taught for about 10 years now, and that time I've taught from 4th through 11th grade, so run the gamut. But I've been in high school for the last couple of years.
Trisha, please.
Sure. Hey, hi, I'm Trisha Maano. I currently teach 5th grade in Hawthorne, California at 138th Street School. We are currently going through a name change as our founder school name is our first governor of California, and as of the last few years, some articles have come out about him. So we are currently changing our name to support someone who is more deserving of being our school name. And so that's that. I've been working with students for over 20 years in many different capacities, after school care, instructional aid. I taught English in China for 1.5 years, and which landed me currently in my elementary school teacher position, which I'll be going into my 6th year teaching 5th grade.
Dr. Alvarez.
Sorry, I was muted. So my name is Eddie Francisco Alvarez Jr. I'm currently about to start a position at Cal State Fullerton. Before Fullerton, I was at Portland State, where I was Kiara's professor. And before Portland State, I taught women, gender, sexuality studies, and I also taught a first year seminar learning community called Race and Social Justice. Prior to Portland, I was in upstate New York, and I taught in the Africana and Latino Studies department. And before my life in academia, I worked for LA Unified for I worked for LA Unified for almost 10 years doing after school programming. I was a paraprofessional for several years before I started teaching 5th grade and then 4th grade before I left to go on to graduate school. So it's nice to be here to have a conversation with folks who have taught it similar, have had similar journeys as I too. So, yeah.
So basically the format, now that the introductions, I'm gonna go through the questions. I have a few that I came up with myself, and I also have an audience Q&A portion. You don't necessarily have to answer all of the questions. That's why I wrote down a bunch, because I knew that, not everyone might have an answer. If you could please, if you have an answer to the question, please use the raise hand button. I just think that helped me moderate it a little bit easier, and have a more organized structure. So my first question would be, it's kind of very general on the broad topic. So how can educators make their classrooms more inclusive? How can they teach a well-rounded curriculum and discuss history without watering it down? I know it's technically 3 questions in one, but I think they all kind of connect. Please let me know if you need me to repeat the question at any point. Yes, Dr. Albert.
Yeah, for the first part of that question about making the classroom more inclusive, I think that for me, that's a huge question, in the sense that educators, we have to do a lot of introspective work, right? I think, and I'm citing here, I want to cite like Gloria Anzaldúa, who's a queer Chicana feminist, thinker, who talked about inner worked public acts, right? She talked about we have to do that internal work and interrogate who we are and our position of privilege and all of the ways that we exist in the world, and how we show up in the classroom, right? And so I think that helps us to think about what could be some of the ways that our privileges, right? Or ways that we have experienced the world can not allow us to see some of the things that our students are going through, right? And for us not to reproduce some of the things that harm that has been done to us too. So I think introspection is really huge. I don't know that that's emphasized enough in terms of being an educator, right? I think it goes across the gamut, like to activists too, right? And just in general, we should be doing that, but definitely introspection. And I know that in teacher training programs, there's some of those activities where, who are you in relation to your students, but there isn't enough. And your questions really made me think a lot about teacher training programs, and that some of the things that I experienced when I was in teacher training programs in the credential program back in the day, in the mid 2000s, some teachers or teachers in training are also experiencing. So there's definitely a lapse there. So I know that doesn't answer all of the questions, but I can come back to some of them too. So.
Real quick, Andrea, I see you've now entered the chat. We're starting on the question portions, but if you could just give like a brief introduction of yourself really quick before we go back to the questions, that'd be great. Thank you. I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Okay, my name's Andrea Kawasa. I'm a special education teacher for Peter Burnett School. I've been a teacher in the special day classroom for about 18 years. So I teach at Peter Burnett School, Wiseburn Unified School District. Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay, thank you. And then is anyone else? Well, the first question was, how can educators make their classrooms more inclusive? And how can they teach a well-rounded curriculum? How can they discuss history without watering it down? If anyone else would like to answer the question, please feel free to do so.
I'll jump in. I think the partner to reflecting on yourself and your identity is also reflecting on who's in the room, right? And knowing like who are your students, right? What are the different identities, cultures, perspectives that are present? And how can you honor those in addition to what are maybe the identities and cultures that aren't in the room, right? And how can you bring those in too, so that you're not like presenting a sort of a myopic view, right, of history. I think those are both profoundly important, right? Knowing your students important for a million different reasons, but one is just straight up so that you can honor who they are, right, and what their interests are. Your third question about like watering down history, for me at least, like watering history down has never been the issue. It's been making it hopeful. I think I have a tendency personally to just stare into the abyss a little too much. And when you're teaching like 7th and 8th graders, and anybody really, right, you need to balance out like the history of oppression with like critical hope and the legacy of different struggles and movements for social justice and progress. So that, like, I know for as long as I've been teaching is something I try to like keep in the forefront of my mind, is making sure that we're not just looking at like the ways people have been oppressed and are oppressed. We're also looking at like and uplifting the voices and the people who have resisted and what we can learn from that to like continue in those legacies.
I'll go next. How do I get rid of that though? Okay, well, I think for me, you know, having this be my 6th year of teaching, I'm still a major work in progress. So a lot of these ideas are something that I'm still continuing to cultivate in my classroom. But I know that I know that part of it is modeling the inclusive language that I would like to see other students use. And also to increase my own cultural competence, because I know that I've lived whatever privilege that I have or from the experiences that I've had, and making connections with my students is really important. And so similar to what everyone's been saying, just making sure to honor who's in my classroom and really getting to know them, and making sure that they feel representation and identified inside my class.
I think that building on what has been said, and that I also apply at different moments, for me to make the classroom more inclusive, it's also to provide the space for reflection in it. And so, and this is something I learned when I started, that it wasn't only me talking about these issues or lecturing, but how do we discuss them and how do we impact them, and then also doing the work of decoupling our feelings to the content and be able to do that. And sometimes that's easier said than done, especially when we encounter resistance to these ideas that we had thought they were they were correct for us, or for and in here I'm thinking of it collectively. So one thing that I invite class members, I always think of them as class members because it's an inclusive membership as opposed to I'm the teacher, you're the student. It is that we're an inclusive community, that we're collectively know more when we discuss this, and that we go through thinking of these issues that have been so hard. And I think that also what Dan said about like having that concept of which I think of Gramsci, this Gramsci thought of the pessimist of the intellect, but then the optimism of the spirit. So this is when I when I talk about these histories that are difficult, but also in that the difficult part of thinking of how we humans have been horrible, to also think of the many things that we thought that were impossible, the solidarities that were created across groups, across class lines, across people that didn't perhaps see each other, and they thought that it was impossible, and then how they made it possible. So that's one of the ways that I also offer, instead of watering down like everybody got along and we all live very happy. No, this is a constant journey. It's not a destination, and to be able to imagine the impossible, we need to see what other people at a point also make the impossible make it possible.
I think from my perspective, it's interesting. When I first started teaching 18 years ago, my students were segregated completely. They didn't eat lunch with their classmates. They missed field trips because they weren't connected to Gen Ed. They were completely segregated in every aspect. Now, I also recognize that they've come a long way, because 20 years ago, they would have been in a completely separate setting away from students who aren't disabled. So for me, it's been very interesting because on the one hand, we're becoming more inclusive because I can visually see at our district the diversity and the change. But on the other hand, I am somebody who's working within a system where my kids are still in a separate classroom, right? And then I'm also working in a situation that the kids who are in my separate classroom, for the most part, are low-income minority students who don't have a voice. And the students with disabilities who are not in my classroom are from well-connected, affluent families. So I'm living that and trying to constantly trying to make that visual could serve a disservice, could be of service or a disservice. So an example of that could be I'm giving you guys the example. So as it relates to race relations in the public education system, the fact that students with disabilities are also segregated within that system currently today, and there is no voice for them because the only voices that are, and could be a pessimist, but right now the only voices that are being honored are well-connected, affluent children of families who are college educated, who work in the education system, who have money, and then my migrant families or my immigrant families or my families who don't have time, don't feel empowered, are the ones who are currently, you question the level of service they're getting compared to the other ones that I see. So at the same time, I've taught at this district long enough to see how much we've come, to see the level of collaboration with the general education teachers, to see that my kids are, feel a part of the classrooms where in the past they haven't. I've seen that trajectory. So I'm aware that we're moving forward, as well. So it's a weird little situation. So that question is tricky for me because on the one hand, there's a race issue. And on the other hand, there's students with disabilities, lives matter too, kind of thing going on at the same time, and for some of our kids, it's a double whammy for them.
Yeah, we actually do have a question about that, which I will discuss in the audience Q&A portion. But I think I want to move on to the next question. So on our Google form asking for audience questions, we had many people say that they had first learned about their POC history in college. I personally was 18 the first time I learned about Mendez versus Westminster, the California case that preceded Brown versus Board of Education. And I was living in Oregon when I read this. And I have been in LA school districts my entire life growing up. So I was wondering what you guys think teachers can help do to break down the idea of Black and white history, because I feel like textbooks, they typically just portray it as like Black and white. You don't hear about like the Latinx experience, the Indigenous experience, the Asian experience, etc. So yeah, what do you think teachers and educators can help do to break down that idea and include other voices of color or experiences of other POC in American history? Yes, Dr. Alvarez.
Sorry about that. Also, my connection's a little spotty, so if I lose you for a second, I'm coming right back, okay? I get that response, Kiara, from a lot of my students that say, wait, I never heard of this ever till now. How is that possible, right? Not just about, Westminster, Mendez versus Westminster, but just other, events in history, right? Which speaks to our mainstream, right? Like education system, right? That unless they're in a, you know, school that actually teaches ethnic studies curriculum, they're not necessarily getting that, right? But I think for me, something that has become clear, especially because I'm always learning as an educator, always, right? Since I taught in LA Unified until now as a college professor, you know, it's a learning process. But one thing that's really important, I think, is to, and Kiara, you alluded to that binary thinking, right? And thinking about history. And so it's important to really think about history as a process, the interconnectedness of history, right? And also and one of my colleagues at PSU just published something on the simultaneity of things that are happening in history, right? And so she wrote an article about anti-indigenous policies in the U.S. That were corresponding with anti-Asian, right, anti-Chinese in particular policies, right, that was connected to anti-Blackness, right? And so for me, really helping students to understand the interconnectedness of the ways that groups have been oppressed, but also the solidarity, as Dr. Leal mentioned, right? Also solidarity movements, and that these moments in history where folks have been oppressed or have been resistant and resilient don't happen in a bubble, right? Like they're interconnected in many different ways. So that's one of the ways that I think we could do that.
What do you think, Trisha? From the elementary lens.
Yes, Dr. Leal.
And I definitely want to hear from Trisha on this. So I'll be really quick. As a Mexican American historian that studies the Latinx ethnic Mexican experience, this was something that I was confronted with, just even teaching as a TA in my graduate program, because it was like, okay, well, you're teaching this little part of history, or you and seeing how my friends at teaching K to 12 had to find all this very rich history in 1 week, right? And the way we think about it as historians is relational. Is that it's a relational history that really gives us more than the comparison and contrast, but that our experiences as the different peoples, groups that make up the U.S. and also in the world are related. They're related in terms of how they deal with each other, how different governments and systems have dealt with them. And so their experiences are related, and also relational in terms of how one group is treated or created. It's going to be very similar. So, for example, the Asian Americans, how they in the path to create the Exclusion Act, the U.S., what discourses and policies they created, and then those same stereotypes were applied to Mexican Americans, to African Americans later on. So that's one part of the relational part, but also the relational is like, what do all these different people have in common as groups, right? And how from them, find those solidarities again. So for me, it is to understand that this, instead of thinking them as different groups, no, it's all part of this history, because it's to understand history in relational ways. So.
I was just going, as an elementary school teacher, I actually had the opportunity to attend the Williamsburg Teacher Institute a couple of years ago. And for me, it was interesting because they put you in this position where you're in this working town that imitates life from the past. But what they did that I thought was really important, and what I saw value in something to bring into my own classroom, was they actually had actors who came in and basically were this figure from history. And it wasn't just, George Washington came, Thomas Jefferson came, but we also had a Native American who came from the Pamunkey tribe and talked with us as himself, not just a character, because he actually lived on the reservation. But then we also had Ann Wager, who taught at the first Black school in Virginia. And so those types of moments where we were getting to look at some of the figures who weren't as visible in the history books that I read and the history that I was taught, I thought was a really important moment for us as educators in that group to really make sure that when we went back to our classrooms that we honored that and acknowledged that. And just at the same time connecting the past to the present, because one of the key things that I took away was when I teach from exploration to the Revolutionary War. So we're looking at a lot of the indigenous people of the area as well. And when we were talking about that, we have our students really learn about different tribes and how they function, but looking at them today as well is really important, because if not, they have this perception of what was in the past and not realizing that there's this connectedness now. They're working jobs just like us. I mean, there was a disconnect that I saw, and that was extremely eye-opening for me to see, similar to what you guys are all talking about, this interconnectedness, that we need to kind of also bring the past to the present and look at how those kind of shape one another as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what everyone has brought up so far, right? The dominant narrative of history in our country tends to be starting at like the founding fathers, moving through the Civil War, where Lincoln ended slavery, and then after the Civil Rights Movement, everything was fine, and we love Martin Luther King, right? I think our job as teachers, especially as history teachers, is to complicate and expand on that narrative, right? When we talk about indigenous folk, that story can't stop at Wounded Knee. If we talk about like the Civil Rights Movement, then we also need to talk about how Black Panthers impacted the Brown Berets and the active indigenous movement in the 70s and the creation of the term Asian Americans. And then we need to look at like how a lot of these different groups have historically been pitted against each other, right? For strategies of divide and conquer. And I think so much of it is, yeah, it's seeing how are these different movements connected, right? What are the stories that are lifted up? What are not? And like helping to bring some of those stories more into the mainstream, or at least into like the consciousness of our students. So then we can start asking, well, why, right? Why is this particular narrative the one that's highlighted over others? Why, like to stick with Dr. King, right? Why is the narrative now of one of like unabashed love and national hero when at the time he was killed, right? The majority of Americans were very against a lot of what he was saying and doing, which it doesn't get talked about as much these days. So I think it's revealing the stories and then helping our students ask questions about why are some privileged over others.
I just wanted to add something, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, I just wanted to say also, and this goes back to the both questions that you posed for us, is that, and part of the work that I do is also, within queer studies and queer Latinx studies, right? And so it's really important for us to also, in this watering down of history and this sort of very limited perspective, we also look at history and teach often from a cisgender heteronormative perspective, right? That I think we have, and this goes back to like the interrogation of ourselves, right? And I know that that can get tricky, when you teach elementary school, right? But and I was confronted with that as a queer Latino teacher myself. When I tried to bring those topics up in my classroom, and felt some resistance, from the students, and try not to take it personally, like Jorge said, but now that I teach at the university level, it's different, and I've taught entire courses on queer communities of color, right? But I think that also, Dan, you mentioned Martin Luther King, and often like Bayard Rustin gets ignored too, right? So I think it's important to also think about how are queer and trans voices of color present or not in our curriculum, right? And I, we have queer students even from elementary school on to college, right? And so what does that mean when they don't hear their stories. And we have more and more children's books that are addressing different types of families, right? And gender nonconforming children. And so I think, you know, children with disabilities, right? And so I think that I just wanted to bring that in because that's very important to me. And I think that, you know, if I had, as a queer kid in the 80s and 90s, had, you know, been exposed to this, I mean, I know it was a different time, you know, back then, and even in high school, it wasn't taught, right? Like, I graduated in 1995 from North Hollywood High School, and there was no discussion of this, right? So I just want to make sure that we keep that also present too, in an intersectional way, right? Too, right? And that Stonewall, you know, gets also considered as an important event in our history too, because, you know, it was women of color that were, you know, led that liberation movement. So,
does anyone else want to answer the question? This is a good segue into the third question, but I want to make sure everyone who had an answer has a chance to answer the question. Okay, so we're gonna move into the third question. Which Dr. Alvarez touched on this a little bit. How would or do you deal with pushback from parents who may try to tell you to quote unquote keep politics out of the classroom when you are teaching on certain topics such as race, gender, sexuality, disability, etc.?
Let's see here. How do you raise your hand? Old school.
I don't know where it is.
Yeah, it's, you know, again, elementary lens, special needs lens, all that lens. But from the lens of Trisha and I, you know, this is the social studies curriculum, and this is the book that you have, and you will teach from this book, and these are the chapters you need to cover and the units you need to teach, okay? And nothing else is added to that unless you add it yourself. And then at that point, from a teacher's lens in public school, it is about like, can I talk about this topic or should I not talk about this topic? You know, but for the most part, I mean, Trisha, our social studies book, who's the last president? When was the last time? Who's our last president on the last social studies book we have? Is it
George Bush Jr.?
It's George Bush. You know, it hasn't been updated. You know, it's not the priority, but yet, you know, that's what we have to. That's what we used to have to work with. It's so exciting right now to see this paradigm shift happening. It was already happening before the COVID, and now it's really happening where it's turning that system upside down, which gives an opportunity for amazing teachers like Trisha who love social studies and history to feel more free to include topics. But for me, what it boils down to in terms of the students, from the lens of the students I serve, is what are those skills? You know, what are those skills that is requiring all of us here today to be able to see the connections, to be able to make these analytical, have these conversations, and to be able to make connections from then which we come up with our own conclusions, and then we do this again and make more connections, right? So what are those skills? And that's what I'm most interested in, given that I'm teaching grassroots and I need my little babies to gain those skills so that they can be informed voters, and so that they can do all these other things. So there's a history component to it, but then I think there's also this critical thinking piece, and breaking that down in terms of how can I explicitly teach that skill? Because from there, you know, and how can I use history and social studies, or how can I use the students' history, what's most exciting for them today, for my students, it has to be what they're into, and put it in that historical framework and help them make the connections in those ways. So for me, it's about those competencies. And you know, I see that as a really important link to cultural studies. And those are the competencies that wasn't necessarily happening in an elementary school for a long time, because the way the system is working now is these are adopted programs by major corporations that the students are investing in, that the districts are investing in, and the expectation is that we follow lockstep. You know, we are, you know, Tricia and I are from a small district, and we've been blessed to have flexibility. But when you're talking, you know, LA Unified School District, and they're spending millions of dollars, and you know, it used to be that you went into principals went into your classroom to see what lesson you what lesson you better be on the same lesson as everybody else. So I think just it's a complicated question that you're asking, because there's some social development skills that we're taught, that I'm thinking about, and those are the skills that help us make sense of history. Yeah.
I guess it's also a part of the question, like how would you deal with pushback along with like parents, also just like the school district in general, that may try to tell you that like, no, you can't teach this. Like, how would you go about that?
The new like California social science like framework and standards are a history teacher's best friend right now.
Yeah.
Because you pointed that, right? If like a teacher says you can't talk about racism or you can't talk about LGBTQ issues, then like you pull out the standards. You can say, well, actually, these are the different places where the state of California says that I have to.
Yeah.
So for administration, I think that's the biggest thing. For families and for kids, I mean, every year, regardless of the grade that I teach, but especially in high school, gender and sexuality, those are the issues that I get the biggest pushback on from kids and from families. And I learned real quickly that like saying, don't be homophobic, like learn this doesn't work. So I, as much as possible, try to like make it a year-long dialogue, right? Like with families, when I know we're coming up to readings that like they're going to have issues with, I try to call them and like talk through it first, right? And be like, hey, this is what we're going to be reading with the kids. This is what we're going to be talking about it. What are your feelings and questions about it? Not to ask permission, but to include them in the conversation, right? And the same thing with students, where I know there's a kid who's like has a tendency to shout something out that's going to offend people. Talk to that kid in advance, right? Remind them of like, these are what our classroom norms are. This is what we feel about oppressive language. Let's you and I have this conversation. So when we do it as a class, you're a little more prepared for it. And like my hope, right, is that by the end of the year, by the end of like my time working with that kid and that family, that we've made some progress on like shifted mindsets a little bit. I know that doesn't always happen, but I think even for the families that it doesn't, having a conversation instead of just reacting, I think makes a big difference.
I think that I'll add quickly that in the college level, in some ways, you do have more liberty, because we're not going, I mean, we create our own curriculum based on and understanding what the class will be about. But there is definitely a pushback. You can also see it in our ratemyprofessors.com sometimes. And I have always said it is kind of part of the struggle where I'm a historian. I have taught in mostly history departments, but then I have in some evaluations that I get, it is, well, this should have been a Chicana Studies course. Or, but the way I deal with this, when the student is kind of the reluctant student, as we call it, what history gives us, and also this huge body of work to the present, it is, here are the hard data, the facts, the sources. And what I do a lot in those terms is to be able to say, look, these are the primary sources of the people that experience this, or the people that mandated this mistreatment or this racist policies. And here it is. And so we look at primary sources as a way to be able to say, well, this inherently history has been political, inherently our human experience is political and based on these decisions. And let's understand that from looking at these sources. And so once you see that, I mean, it's not my opinion, it is what the sources are. And yes, we might be able to interpret them in different ways, but sometimes they're most of the times they're very explicit. And so I think bringing it back to the knowledge, to the sources, really helps, as Dan says, a bit of mind shifting or even internal questioning. This is not to say, and I don't think I have the best answer of how to deal with this type of students. I mean, there's sometimes the pushback is just it is for them to just kind of like say, okay, I'm going to take a step back instead of, always pushing it, right? But it is, for me, it's always and this deals with, I think, other questions that you're thinking about. And I said I was going to be quick, and I'm not being quick, but it is to bring back to the primary sources, to what, and the data. And for me, it's also to showcase the work, the cultural production, be it music, be it art, of Black, Indigenous people of color. And so we're able to reshift that in, and even when you have a reticent student, they are exposed to and to knowledge that can counter them, can counter their previous position.
If no one else needs to say, we're gonna move on to the last questions, a part of like my question list, and then into the audience Q&A portion. We might go a little bit over. I'm sorry. I tried my best. I'm gonna try my best to keep it in. Understand you guys are busy. So I wanted to ask, how can teachers touch on topics such as, let me start over. Sorry. When I was in the 7th grade, we did this project where we were learning about the genocide that was occurring in Darfur. Which was kind of the first time that I think I'd been introduced to international history while being taught in an American curriculum. So how can teachers touch on topics such as racism, slavery, etc. on a global scale? Because I know that, like, in the US, it's very like, this is our history and everything else, and they don't really touch on like international topics, but I feel like in other countries they do. Like, I feel like other countries know American history, but we in America don't know international history.
I'll go real quick or I'll try to be as sustained. For me, I teach my area of study is transnational histories, and the one thing, and this really opens up understandings of how societies work, how racism works, how homophobia works, how even the way we think about able bodies work, which is that the way we think of history is unfortunately by this creation of the nation state. And I think that rocks students' minds to think that the way we understand nations is really a recent phenomenon. I mean, like the way we understand how a country is created in the ways we think of it now. So once we start thinking and interrogating what is a nation state and why is it that they were created, and how history supports the nation state project of, as you said, Kiara, emphasizing just one nation. But then when we start thinking every nation is connected to other nations, and then they're in this kind of competition to create systems of categorizing people, and they might borrow from each other, again, the relational understanding, right? But that ultimately then we see that nation states are not these islands. And even when they have been islands, then they are connected to the world. And again, the interconnectedness of how colonialism has affected the world, and even in nations that have colonized people, colonialism has come to them. Imperialism has come to them in different ways. So for me, it's super important to always understand history as a transnational study of peoples and in different eras. And the last thing I would say that it's really coming to the front. There was, when we think of this moment of globalism or globalization, and we think, oh, it's super new and we were a part of it, and then the pandemic happens. Guess what? Right before the 1918 pandemic, it was another moment of globalization. And then we can then discuss how even globalization is not a new concept, and how these big crises either create or foster connections, but then also halt connections. So I think it's really important to not only think of transnationalism, but also think of how it has also happened in the past, the connection between different communities and nations.
I'll just kind of add to that. Again, like teaching 5th grade, my area is literally U.S. history. So this gives me something to think about on how can I'm really glad you asked this question, because I think it is really valid and important. And just kind of thinking about even when we're discussing just within the revolution, there are other countries that are involved there that we don't really delve into, but again, I really like this idea of the past and the present and looking at things that are happening now that we can connect to things that we're learning in the revolution or in whatever it is that we're discussing. And I think that you gave me a lot to think about. So I'm thankful for that, so that I could kind of think about these other ways to broaden my students' minds and thoughts, and help them see themselves as agents of change, maybe not even just in their own country, but just globally as well.
For me, to go back to what some of you are saying, the idea of having students understand colonization and conquest, right, and how that was tied, to obviously to the slave trade, right, and how that's tied to capitalism, right, and the linkage between those historical moments and present processes, right, which you're all sort of mentioning. I think that's really important, and how they're not, again, that connection, right, the present is connected to the past, and in what ways, right? And I asked the students a question like, why are we all sitting in this room? Like, all of us who look in the way that we all look, how did we all end up here? There's a history that's interconnected of how we're all here, right? And I have students who say, oh, my neighborhood was all white, there was no people of color in my neighborhood. Okay, how did that happen, right? And that's connected to these broader historical processes, even global processes. So I think, again, making those connections, right? And just one quick example of, like, I have students who, are surprised that there are Spanish-speaking Black people, right? Like from different countries in Latin America, and it's because there's that disconnect to understand the reach, right, of the slave trade, right? And so even that, because of that U.S. focus, often we lose that, right? Students lose that, and that wasn't the focus when I was growing up. That wasn't emphasized for me, right? So I was probably one of those students that was surprised, like, oh, there's people in Mexico that are Black, that speak Spanish and are Mexican, right? Like, because we may not learn that history, or it's not focused on. So,
I mean, it sounds like you had a pretty great 7th grade teacher. I think climate change is a really helpful lens for this as well, right? Like, questioning why is it that the global South is feeling the effects of climate change so much more than like the most heavily industrialized nations who are producing and causing a lot of the climate change. I think if you start with that, then there's so many ways that, regardless of the course, you can connect what's happening in one place to what's happening literally anywhere else in the world.
So we're gonna move into the audience Q&A portion. We kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but Sarah, a college junior, would like to know how you discuss the term privilege to your students. Privilege including skin tone, income, even just like family relationships, documentation, etc. And I know we also were discussing like able-bodiedness, ableism. I don't know what the word I'm looking for here is, but yeah.
In my classes, that's one of the first things that we talk about, right? And we talk about in the context of in lots of different contexts, but we I teach the students about Kimberly Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality, right? And we talk about which was a theory that she devised, that she wrote about and theorized based on the experiences of Black women, right? In a labor dispute case, and that speaks to the way that Black women were oppressed, not just because of their race, but also their gender, right? And of course, that concept has been taken and used in other contexts, right? But I think it's really important for folks to remember, the origins of the use of or the coining of intersectionality, right? Other women of color had been talking about this idea prior to Crenshaw, but she coined that term, intersectionality, right? This idea that the more privileges or the more categories of privilege that someone holds, the more access they're going to have, right? They're going to be able to have experiences in their lives that give them access, right? And I talk about myself when I teach also this concept and talk to the students about how, yes, I am queer and I am Latino or Latinx, but I'm also light skinned, right? And I was also born in the U.S. and so that gives me certain privileges, right? And so I think that helps just for students to see. Anyway, I teach. I could go on all day about this, but just a little bit about how I approach it. And Kiara, you've been in my classes, so I think it's and it's an ongoing conversation, right? It's an ongoing conversation that takes a while for students to sort of understand, right?
I think that's a vocabulary word that is going to be taught moving forward in elementary school. I can't say that I have explicitly taught those concepts, but I imagine from what I was gathering from my students during the shutdown while we had to teach from a distance, that is something that they're going to come in curious about or having heard, wondering about. So I imagine that I would be able to answer that question, after the school year, because I think a lot of elementary schools are going to be looking at that. Teachers are going to be looking at that word and how to put it in context for the students.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think you bring up a great point, because COVID-19 is really making clear how people, are privileged in so many ways, that are able to teach from home, are able to, self-quarantine and not be in contact with folks, right, where others can't, right? So I think that's definitely, COVID-19 is just bringing, exploding this off.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I even noticed that my kids were, we're seeing each other's places behind us, right? And so our kids we're also getting a sense of, wow, he has his own bedroom and his own situation. And, they were starting to see it, it's all that's new for our kids. So definitely.
I think these terms are really powerful tools for everybody, right? But especially for teaching our kids. Like, I know I've had over the course of this summer, a lot of conversations with students who are wrestling with how to talk to their parents and their elders about the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Because it's a lot of my students who are very supportive of it, and parents and other family members who are very not, right? And so helping equip them with words like privilege and intersectionality so that they can have those kinds of conversations with their families, and even just for themselves, the mental framework to make sense of what they might intuitively feel is right, is, I think, profoundly powerful and important, and highlights the importance of stories and storytelling in this process for any theory, right? I think if just couched as theory, it's easy for people to respond either as super defensive or from a very much of a deficit lens. But when with context, with personal narratives and stories and experiences, I think that's what helps that theory come to life and equip kids with the ability to make it their own.
And kids get it, they get it.
I think one of the utilities as a critical thinking skill, it is for me to think to decouple the personal experience first to the systems, to the structures, and say, yes, I am a man, I'm a straight man, but I benefit from patriarchy. But this is the way it is. First, so one, understanding the relationship between the individual and the structure and the system. I think this goes back to kind of that question of how do you deal with a resistant student, right? So instead of making it just about me, understanding that no, there's these systems, right, that and structures, and in terms of histories, like this is how they organized the war in the past, these are they're organizing the war in the present, but this is how people are undoing them or challenging in the present. So instead of making all of it, our feelings or our own experience, situating it with these structures and these systems. I think that also helps understanding our privilege, where we have privilege, where we lack the privilege, but also in systematic ways. And I think that that's so great to think of in that critical thinking, because that once you get it, if you are in fifth grade or if you're a 20-year-old, then you're able to see it in this larger landscape instead of like, this is me and this is my family and or my peers.
And just to kind of add on to it, thinking about how this hasn't been something maybe that I've particularly spoken about, and there is that uncomfortableness that comes with it, knowing like the parent pushback and everything we talked about, but it's almost now like we have to have these uncomfortable conversations. And so for me, it's a lot of it's going to be about letting students know it's okay to feel uncomfortable, and that give them kind of the voice to authentically, in my classroom, get to talk about whatever the issues are that we're discussing in general. To I don't know, I guess just again, like give them their voice, again, make that agent of change, and get a little bit uncomfortable and make that a little bit more the norm, so that we can keep moving forward and not just say, oh, well, I don't really want to talk about that because it's, I don't know if how they're going to react to it, or how their parents are going to feel about when they hear about it. And I really like the discussion that we had a bit back about how, Dan, how you were involving kind of the parents in the conversation, not saying like, this is what we're going to talk about today, but just kind of involving them, not letting them know this is it, but just saying like, be a part of it too. Let's all kind of work together.
From JT, another college junior, they asked, what are you as an educator doing to educate your students on the full history of this country while also unifying students? I know like this whole conversation is kind of like dealt with it a little, but I really like this question of like, while you also unify your students, like Giselle, you mentioned earlier, like it's these groups of people have constantly been pitted against each other, and how that relates. So what can you do to like unify your students? And it's all and also talk about intersectionality.
I think part of that goes back to like what Dr. Leal just brought up about systems and structures, right? For looking at like what are the systems and structures that exist and have existed in this country, right? And how can we subvert them? And how have they historically been used, right, to oppress and divide? I know for me, like I have a large population of newcomers, right, in my school. So it's a lot of students who don't necessarily have like a lot of the context, right, that the students who have spent their entire lives here might have. So providing that context and like for everyone involved, like the ability to like think critically about why is our community policed the way that it is, right? For starters, why is funding divided the way that it is, helps. And like that's a great question because it's one I struggle with a lot. Like we have at my school a very clear divide between like the newcomers and the students whose parents might have immigrated here, or they immigrated here when they were much younger. So within a group that on the census might all be lumped together, right? When you get into like the messiness of actual human beings, it's a lot less clear cut, right? And that was, for me, when I was new to the school, not something I expected to encounter. So I think that's where like involving student voice is really important, is like helping see the structures and systems is one thing, and then figuring out how does this affect us at like an immediate local level, and what can we actually do about it, is a whole other.
Yeah, I think on the elementary level, same thing. It's that student voice piece is really, really important to me for that very reason. Also, creating a sense of community within our classroom is on a micro elementary level kind of a building block, and the power of student voice to help that create that sense of community within that classroom, and having the kids experience the healthy disagreements based on, policies and procedures that they want to implement within the classroom, those kind of things. Any opportunities to provide student voice is helpful.
I think that building on that, the power of the story, the personal, the story of the past or the present, and how I think that it's a bit different, but even when I was at LACMA, I would always try to subvert things a bit by bringing in a different voice, a voice that it's not centered, be it, from antiquity Rome or the riots of the mid 20th century, which is, in my readings, I always bring in the work of Black authors, indigenous authors, queer authors, obviously Latinx authors, because that helps us to grasp at this whole history. So it's what do we teach? And so it's something. And one thing that I was doing when I was at the Cal States as a lecturer was a lot of the work that I would assign was already open on the web. So you didn't have to go to a book, but here's this documentary that you can see freely on PBS, or you can see even on the web because somebody posted it on the web. And then with that, it's also creating this narrative, this arc narrative that I think if you see I have this poster that I always show, which is the more, ultimately, I study history because I'm interested in the futures of how we can create solidarity with people that we think that we might not, but ultimately, what are things that we want to move forward together? And so I think that it is also really important to, yes, look at the very difficult moments of history in the past, but also see when this solidarity, these unions, or just this progress that seems so improbable and it happened, and then imagine them how we want to see them in the future. And that is powerful because then you give that, you don't give them, you give the platform for people to imagine, for students to imagine that. Yeah. And that possibility of what kind of a future could be if we transcend what has separated us, and why is, just even thinking, why is it that this separates us, and then build on that to imagine those moments of solidarities.
Okay, so final question, and then I'll let you guys go. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but is there anything else that you would like current educators or even students like me who are considering pursuing careers in education to know about making their classroom a diverse, intersectional space?
I think constantly reflect. Like, we all have biases, right? And whether we're aware of them in the moment or not, they come out in what we do and how we respond to things. So I think constantly reflecting on our interactions, on our curriculum, right? On what we choose and choose not to elevate, I think is profoundly important, right? Like we as teachers, like, I should always be learning about myself, about the world, about my kids, about the art of teaching. And I think that's the number one, is like, don't settle. And if this is our last go around, I want to shout you out too, Kiara, just for putting this on. I mean, like, I taught you when you were in 7th and 8th grade, and seeing you like in the work you're doing now, and the conversations you're having, like, keep having those conversations, keep doing this amazing work, because it gives me so much hope, and amidst everything else that's happening right now. So thank you.
Just to kind of add on to that too, I think just strengthen community, having these types of conversations, talking with others, learning from each other is definitely, for me, I gained so much just from this hour conversation we've had, just to give me more to think about as a lifelong learner educator, knowing that I want to continue moving forward. So thank you for giving us this space to have this conversation. Definitely very proud of you.
I also want to echo Kiara, that I'm so proud of you. I was just telling my partner earlier today, and you earlier when we talked on the phone, just to see how since I met you a few years ago, you transferred to USC, and you're working, you created this amazing project, and then organizing this is just makes my teacher heart very proud. And I can't wait to see all the great things that you'll continue to do. And it's just been such a privilege for me to be in this conversation with you all. I rarely, I see Jorge, we've been on panels and stuff on conferences, but just to be on a panel with you all who are doing, very difficult work in K through 12, I commend you, and I've been there. I've been there, and I always tell this story, but I haven't been as tired as I was when I taught elementary school, and I was in my 20s. I was in my mid 20s. So but I've learned so much also, and I'm appreciative, because I really do, so many of the students that come through my classroom are going to be teachers probably, or are going to be social workers, or are going to, be in a field where they're helping people. And I think to have the tools, right, to be able to think critically, as many of you have talked about, and to interrogate these systems, is just so important. So yeah, I'm just feeling very grateful.
I think, hello? Yes, so thank you. I think it's interesting because it's a scary time for teaching, but it's also such an exciting time to become a teacher. I feel like watching Trisha and watching, I think Trisha, are you considered in the millennial Gen X? Maybe. But anyway, I just feel like I'm so excited to watch these future educators, because what you're thinking about as a beginning teacher, I wasn't. And I struggled, and the combination of all these ingredients, breathing technology, exciting about change, pushing forward with change, your generation, I'm just so excited to see what this future educators will do to help our culture and improve our culture. Teaching is a practice in my view, and it's an art form. It can be an art form. If you study it and learn, I concur with the other panel that, reflection is key. Having your colleagues that you trust watch you teach and then give you feedback at the coffee shop and do something different, the next time. That kind of stuff is what has your practice growing, and that's the kind of stuff, you're passionate about the subject that you love, but you're also passionate about this craft called teaching and this practice. And the key there is reflection and opening yourself up to colleagues that you trust, that can be a little anal with the practice, but it's just, it's like jazz musicians, teachers are like composers, there's so many different things that you got to play with, and those teachers that can do that, those, they're working at it, and it's a craft. So I would encourage any future young teachers to, reflect, enjoy yourself, and be amongst your peoples that are teaching nerds too, that want to continue growing.
And I think I would add one. Kiara, I think that I'm one of the last people you have taken a class with me. So one thing that I really like about this part of teaching, and I say this because of my colleagues, you all have done the work that I didn't think I was ever going to do. I never saw myself, at least in my 20s, I was a TA for a while, and it was very tiring, and I didn't have the tools then to teach. So I never thought I was going to teach. And here I am. Later on, I really found, and the reason I found the joy, one, it was because of ultimately the radical possibilities of creating an inclusive collective community of learning. And this is something that I would say in creating every class, and it could be the class or it could be your study group. If, for example, if you're a student and you might not be getting this in your classes, then you create it. And the creating is a community that is constantly learning and constantly pushing ourselves to know more and to even critique, what we have learned, because what we learned 20 years ago may not be as accurate as we know now. Because ultimately, collectively, we know more together than in isolation. And with that, we can, those spaces of possibility and might take the shape of an hour class or 50-minute class. Or we can take them, longer when we continue thinking about this after the class, whenever we get to meet again in a coffee shop or just in some conversations, right? And so I think for me, that's for the current educators or the future educators or lifelong learners, this offers that opportunity of creating a community that understands that collectively we know more than if we were to do it ourselves in isolation. So, and also, Kiara, thank you so much for this invitation, for learning so much from my colleagues, which I admire what each of you do at the different places, because every single place where we're trying to enact this change and do this mind shifting.
So lastly, I just want to thank all of you for agreeing to do this. Thank you so much. As I said earlier, I guess you've already mentioned this, but I've had the honor and pleasure of being taught by all but two of you. So again, thank you so much.